December 1950. A frozen ridgeline near the Korean border. The wind carried snow across abandoned foxholes, and every breath turned into a cloud before disappearing into the darkness. A platoon of exhausted U.S. Marines had just completed another brutal night of holding their position against repeated attacks. Boots were soaked. Gloves were stiff with ice. Faces were covered in soot and frost. No one expected visitors before dawn. Then silhouettes appeared through the swirling snow. Hands immediately reached for rifles. Movement. Hold your fire. The figures kept walking without panic. As they came closer, the Marines recognized the unmistakable shape of curved kukris hanging from thick winter uniforms. They were Gurkhas, veterans serving alongside Commonwealth forces. Their reputation had already spread across battlefields from Burma to Malaya. Men who rarely wasted words. Men who had survived wars most soldiers only read about. No one spoke for several long seconds. The Gurkhas looked around the shattered Marine position. Broken sandbags. Frozen blood in the snow. Empty ammunition boxes. Silent corpses covered with blankets. One elderly Gurkha sergeant slowly nodded. Then he quietly said something that every Marine standing there would remember for the rest of his life. "You boys truly did not leave." The wind was the only thing anyone heard after that. Private Daniel Brooks glanced toward Sergeant Walter Hayes, unsure how to answer. Hayes simply removed his helmet, revealing tired eyes that had not closed in nearly 40 hours. "No," Hayes replied. "We couldn't." The Gurkha sergeant introduced himself as Lakpa Rai. His English carried a calm rhythm, and every sentence sounded carefully chosen. "We heard the firing all night," Lakpa said. "We believed no position could survive that." Corporal Ethan Miller laughed once, though there was little humor in it. "Neither did we." The Marines had arrived on the ridge 2 days earlier with orders that sounded simple on paper. Delay enemy advances long enough for wounded units farther south to withdraw. Intelligence estimated light resistance. Instead, wave after wave of enemy soldiers emerged through the mountains under darkness. Every attack had pushed closer. Every hour felt longer than the last. Lieutenant James Carter unfolded a damp map inside a damaged command tent while radio operator Samuel Ortiz struggled to reconnect a frozen communications set. "The line still isn't working, sir." Carter nodded without looking up. "I know." There had been moments during the night when the Marines believed they were completely surrounded. Because they were. Machine gun barrels glowed from constant firing. Mortar ammunition nearly disappeared before midnight. Medic Robert Ellis had already run out of morphine long before sunrise. Still, nobody abandoned the ridge. Lakpa quietly walked through the Marine perimeter, studying every position without saying another word. His younger companion, Rifleman Bur Bahadur, crouched beside one foxhole where Lance Corporal Michael Jensen still gripped his rifle despite falling asleep sitting upright. Bur smiled softly. "He sleeps like our men after Burma." Lakpa answered almost in a whisper. "Because he believes someone else now watches." The Gurkhas immediately began helping without being asked. Some collected frozen firewood. Others reinforced damaged trenches. One repaired torn camouflage netting using spare rope from his own pack. The Marines exchanged confused glances. "We didn't request assistance," Brooks whispered. Lakpa overheard him. "You didn't have to." That single sentence lingered in everyone's mind. Throughout the morning, stories slowly emerged. One Marine described carrying an injured radio operator nearly half a mile under machine gun fire. Another admitted firing his final rounds before fixing his bayonet, convinced hand-to-hand combat was unavoidable. The Gurkhas listened carefully. They never interrupted. Never exaggerated. Never doubted. Near noon, an artillery captain named Richard Collins finally reached the ridge with delayed supplies. He froze after seeing Marines and Gurkhas calmly sharing hot tea beside shattered bunkers. I thought this position was lost. Hayes looked toward the mountain slopes. So did everyone else. Collins walked through the defensive line, counting shell impacts. His expression gradually changed. This wasn't a battle. No. Hayes stared toward the frozen valley. It was a test. Later that afternoon, headquarters requested detailed reports. Officers from multiple commands wanted explanations. How had fewer than 80 Marines held against repeated assaults through an entire freezing night? The written reports focused on ammunition expenditure. Enemy estimates. Casualty numbers. Defensive positions. But none truly captured what happened. Captain Collins eventually asked Lakpa directly. "You fought in more campaigns than most of us." Lakpa considered the question carefully. "What do you think happened here?" The old Gurkha looked across the ridge. "I think men decided another man beside them was worth dying for." No officer wrote that into the official report. Yet every soldier remembered hearing it. That evening temperatures dropped even lower. Fresh snow covered the battlefield until broken rifles and helmets became small white mounds. The Gurkhas prepared to continue toward another assignment at first light. Before sleeping, Bir Bahadur quietly approached Marine Private Brooks. "You were frightened." Brooks almost laughed. "Terrified." Bir nodded. "So was I the first time." "You?" Bir smiled. "Courage is simply fear that continues walking." Brooks never forgot those words. Around midnight another alarm spread across the perimeter. Movement again. Every man grabbed his weapon. This time the approaching figures carried stretchers instead of rifles. South Korean civilians had become trapped between advancing armies. Among them were elderly parents, frightened children, and one young mother carrying an infant wrapped inside torn blankets. Nobody knew how they reached the ridge. The civilians stood silently, expecting to be turned away. Marine Lieutenant Carter immediately ordered food distributed. There wasn't much. Half rations. Cold beans. Hard biscuits. Yet every Marine removed something from his own pack. The Gurkhas quietly did exactly the same. One child stared nervously at Lakpa's cookery. Lakpa noticed. Without speaking, he removed the blade, placed it inside its sheath, then handed the child a wrapped piece of chocolate instead. The little boy smiled. For the first time in days, laughter briefly echoed across the frozen hill. The moment lasted less than a minute. Enemy artillery suddenly struck nearby slopes. Explosions shook the ridge. Snow and dirt blasted into the air. Everyone instinctively shielded the civilians. No orders were necessary. Marines and Gurkhas formed a human wall together. After the shelling ended, every civilian remained alive. Several soldiers had not been so fortunate. Medic Ellis immediately rushed toward the wounded. One Gurkha rifleman named Dil Bahadur suffered severe shrapnel wounds while protecting the children. Marine stretcher bearers carried him without hesitation. "No," Dil protested weakly. "Others first." Ellis firmly shook his head. "Not today." Hours later Dil survived surgery at a field hospital. Years afterward he would still tell younger Gurkha recruits about the Marines who refused to leave him behind. News of the ridge slowly traveled through higher headquarters. At first it sounded like another exaggerated battlefield rumor. Then more witnesses confirmed every detail. Reports eventually reached senior command. Among those reviewing them was General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters. But another respected American commander also heard repeated accounts through returning officers. General Louis "Chesty" Puller. The legendary Marine commander listened quietly while Captain Collins described everything he had witnessed. When Collins repeated Lakpa's words, "I think men decided another man beside them was worth dying for." Puller remained silent for several seconds. Finally he said only one sentence. "That's what Marines are supposed to become." The remark spread almost as quickly as the original story. Months passed. The war continued. Battles came and went. Units rotated home. Some names disappeared into casualty lists. Others returned to families forever changed. Yet veterans from both groups occasionally crossed paths again during later assignments and reunions. Whenever conversations turned toward Korea, someone eventually mentioned that frozen ridge. One evening years after the war, former Marines attended a veterans gathering where several retired Gurkhas were also present. Hair had turned gray. Uniforms had been replaced by civilian jackets. The scars remained. So did the memories. Someone finally asked the question everyone wanted answered. What did you really think after spending that night with the Marines? The room became quiet. Lakpa Rai, now much older, slowly stood. He rested both hands on his walking stick before answering. We came believing we would meet brave American soldiers. He paused. We left believing we had met brothers. Nobody applauded immediately. Some simply lowered their heads. Others wiped away tears they never expected to shed decades after the fighting ended. Former Sergeant Hayes finally stood and walked across the room. Without speaking, he embraced the old Gurkha. Neither man needed more words. Those around them understood. Wars often divide nations. Sometimes they unite strangers forever. History usually remembers victories, famous generals, and maps covered with arrows. Far less often does it remember the quiet respect earned between soldiers who stood together in impossible conditions. The Marines never claimed they fought without fear. The Gurkhas never claimed they were fearless either. Instead, both understood something many people never experience. Real courage is rarely loud. It is found in freezing trenches, shared rations, silent sacrifices, and impossible decisions made for the person standing beside you. Neither group fought for glory on that mountain. They fought because someone had to hold the line. Because wounded comrades depended on them. Because frightened civilians needed protection. Because abandoning each other was never an acceptable choice. Long after medals tarnish and battlefields disappear beneath grass or snow, those choices remain. The stories passed from one generation of soldiers to the next are not always about the greatest victories. Often, they are about moments when ordinary men chose compassion over comfort, duty over safety, and loyalty over survival. On that frozen ridge, two legendary fighting forces recognized something greater than military reputation. They recognized shared character. Perhaps that was the most important victory of all. What would you have done? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more World War II stories where humanity, war, and difficult decisions collided, make sure to subscribe.